I want you to imagine just for a second a world where the idea of human beings strapping themselves to the top of a giant explosive rocket, blasting off into the absolute void of space, and flying all the way to the moon is considered, well, boring.
Right, just completely mundane.
Exactly. Like utterly routine.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine a cultural climate so incredibly dull to the miracles of modern engineering that major television networks literally refuse to broadcast the live feed of astronauts in deep space.
Because they're worried about ratings.
Yes, because they are genuinely worried it will tank their ratings. It's wild. Welcome to the deep dive, by the way. Today, we're looking at the ultimate cure for that complacency. We're doing a detailed historical breakdown of the Apollo 13 mission.
And it is quite the story.
It really is. We want to figure out how a public relations snooze fest turned into the most harrowing, ingenious, and nail-biting rescue mission in human history.
You know, it sounds completely absurd to us sitting here today. I mean, we look back at the entire Apollo era as this untouchable pinnacle of human tension, bravery, and triumph.
Oh, absolutely.
But the reality of how the public, and even the agency itself, felt just before disaster struck is entirely different. It was mostly just apathy.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, because how do you go from the whole world holding its breath for Apollo 11 to an empty theater for Apollo 13 in less than a year?
It was a very fast drop-off.
Right. We were talking about April 11, 1970. This is mere months since Neil Armstrong took that first step on the lunar surface. But the landscape had totally fundamentally shifted. For Apollo 11, you had something like 7 million spectators crowding the highways and beaches to watch the liftoff.
Huge crowds.
But for Apollo 13, just 200,000. People had just kind of moved on.
Yeah.
It's like releasing the greatest blockbuster movie of all time, and by the second sequel, the theaters are completely empty. How does a culture lose interest in space travel so fast?
What's fascinating here is that to understand why that happened, we have to look at the broader psychology and the geopolitical context of the era.
Right, the Cold War.
Exactly. The space race was never purely about scientific discovery for the general public, you know. It was born entirely out of the Cold War. In 1961, President Kennedy made a very specific promise to land a man on the moon and return him safely before the decade was out.
To beat the Soviets.
Precisely. It was a contest against the Soviet Union to prove supreme technological leadership. And once the United States proved they were the technological leaders, that sense of urgency just vanished.
Which leads to a dangerous sense of routine.
Yes. The political objective was officially met. The existential threat was gone. And that cultural apathy had real, tangible consequences for the space program. The government was already aggressively slashing the agency's budget.
Wow, already.
Yeah. Planned future missions like Apollo 20 had been outright canceled by this point. The agency was suddenly in a defensive position where they had to justify their own existence. They had to prove to the politicians that spending billions of dollars on space was still worth the cost.
So the primary objective for Apollo 13 wasn't just to prove we could still get there. They actually had a huge scientific goal, right?
Yes, it was meant to be a rigorous scientific exploration of the Fermaro crater, a site believed to hold deep geological answers about the origins of both the moon and the Earth.
So no pressure at all.
Okay.
And just to add another layer of complexity to this dynamic, the crew on this mission, Commander Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Jack Swigert, they weren't even supposed to be the primary crew.
Right, they were the backup team.
The original crew had various medical and logistical issues that grounded them, so these guys were rotated in. Yet, despite the pressure and the new crew, the first couple of days of the flight are just incredibly, wonderfully boring.
Smooth sailing to the point of literal comedy, honestly.
Right. You have Jack Swigert radioing down to Mission Control to casually ask for a 60-day extension on filing his income taxes from space. I mean, how casual can you get?
Very casual.
And you have the capsule communicator on the ground openly admitting, right at the 46-hour and 43-minute mark, that the spacecraft is in perfect shape and they are, quote, bored to tears down here.
And as we mentioned earlier, the TV networks wouldn't even air their live broadcast from the ship.
Yeah, the only person who really went out of her way to watch the feed was Commander Lovell's wife, sitting in a VIP room at Mission Control.
And you know, that profound sense of routine is exactly what makes the impending disaster so terrifying. It lulls everyone into a false sense of security. But space is an environment that fundamentally does not tolerate routine.
Which brings us to the pivot. Day 3 of the mission, April 13. They are roughly 330,000 kilometers away from Earth, coasting through the dark. Mission Control asks Swigert to do something completely mundane.
Just a routine flip of a switch to stir the oxygen tanks.
And then a literal boom.
A massive physical explosion shakes the entire spacecraft. Instantly, multiple warning lights, alarms, and master alarms start blaring across the panels.
And that is when we get the most famous, chilling understatement in human history. Houston, we've had a problem.
Yeah, the astronauts float over to the window, look out into the blackness, and they can physically see their own oxygen venting out into the vacuum of space.
It's just bleeding out.
Exactly. Tank 2 is completely empty. Tank 1 is draining rapidly. And at first, Mission Control thinks it's just a glitch. They literally cannot believe the telemetry is real.
So, to understand the sheer scale and terror of this specific failure, we need to map out the anatomy of the Apollo 13 spacecraft.
Right. It's comprised of 4 main parts. First, you have the command module. This is an incredibly cramped cone, just 11 feet long and 13 feet in diameter.
Wait, 11 by 13 feet? That's the size of a walk-in closet for 3 grown men? How does that even work practically when things go wrong?
It barely does. It's the main hub where the astronauts sit, containing the primary instrument panels and re-entry heat shields. But it's not designed for long-term habitation without support.
Okay, what's next?
That brings us to the second piece, the service module. This is the unpressurized cylinder attached directly beneath the command module. It's the workhorse.
The powerhouse, essentially.
Exactly. It houses the primary engine, most of the oxygen, and the fuel cells that mix oxygen and hydrogen to generate the ship's electricity and water. Together, they are known as the command and service module.
Got it.
Then, attached to the nose, you have the lunar module, the specialized spider-like craft designed strictly to land on the moon. And finally, there's the launch escape system, which was already safely jettisoned during liftoff.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the explosion happens in that critical service module, crippling their oxygen and power. And the source material dives into exactly why this happened. It is honestly infuriating.
It really is.
It all traces back to a single, completely invisible flaw. Oxygen tank number 2 wasn't even a new piece of hardware. It was originally installed on Apollo 10, but it was removed for modifications.
And during that routine removal, someone accidentally dropped the tank.
Just a few inches.
Yeah, just a tiny drop. But the jolt damaged a small fill and drain tube inside, a completely internal injury to the hardware. Visually from the outside, the tank looked pristine.
Right, but during pre-flight testing on Earth, the engineers realized this tank wouldn't empty its liquid oxygen completely because of that broken tube. So, to get the last bit of liquid out, they decided to use internal heaters to boil the oxygen off.
Which sounds logical.
It does, but there was a fatal design flaw in the tank's thermostat system. The physical thermometer dial was capped, by design, at 30 degrees Celsius.
It was technologically incapable of displaying a number higher than 30 degrees, regardless of the actual internal temperature of the tank.
But wait, if the dial mechanically stops at 30 degrees, why doesn't the system just trigger a shutoff switch so it doesn't overheat?
Because the automatic shutoff switch was electronically tied to that exact same thermometer?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. If the thermometer never reads above 30 degrees, the safety system assumes the tank is still relatively cool, so the heater simply stays on, infinitely drawing power.
That is terrifying. It's like having an oven in your kitchen that is secretly cranking itself up to broil, but the physical dial on the front is stuck at warm.
That's a great way to put it.
You think you're gently heating your dinner, but you're actually melting the machinery of your kitchen from the inside out. And the engineers on the ground had no idea.
None. They are looking at the telemetry. It says 30 degrees. Everything looks fine. But inside, that tank is baking at an unimaginable 538 degrees Celsius.
Which is just insane.
And that extreme hidden heat completely melted the Teflon insulation right off the electrical wires inside the tank, so the engineers sign off on the spacecraft, totally unaware of the internal damage.
So cut to day 3 of the mission, 330,000 kilometers away. Swigert flips the switch for the routine tank stir. Electricity runs through those newly exposed wires. A spark arcs inside a pure oxygen environment, and the tank violently explodes.
The concussive force blew a 13-foot exterior panel completely off the side of the service module.
If that tank is located inside the main cabin, the mission ends right there. No rescue, no duct tape, just gone.
Precisely. It was a stroke of profound luck that the tank was attached to the exterior structure. Had it been internal, the explosion would have depressurized the cabin and killed all 3 astronauts instantly.
But because it was outside, they survived the initial blast.
Right, which simply leaves them alive, but stranded in a bleeding ship, rapidly losing power and breathing air.
Which buys them the horrifying privilege of slowly running out of air.
How does mission control even begin to triage a situation like that? I mean, they have to make the ultimate lifeboat decision immediately.
They do. And the fastest way back to Earth is to just perform a U-turn. Just turn the ship around and burn the main engine?
But they didn't do that.
No, because that was an utterly unacceptable risk. The primary engine of the service module was located directly adjacent to where the massive explosion had just occurred.
Ah, so it might be damaged.
Exactly. No one on Earth or in space had any idea if the engine bell or the fuel lines were compromised. If they fired that main engine, it could trigger a secondary explosion and instantly vaporize the entire spacecraft. So they have to pivot to the second option, which is taking the long way around. They decide to let the spacecraft continue its current trajectory toward the moon, swing entirely around the far side of it, and use the moon's gravity to slingshot them back toward Earth.
It's vastly safer because it doesn't require that potentially damaged main engine.
But it takes 4 to 5 agonizing days.
And to survive a journey of that length with a dying power supply, Mission Control ordered the crew to do the unthinkable, completely shut down the command module.
Which is terrifying.
They had to power down the navigation, the heaters, the computers, everything, to conserve whatever drops of electricity were left for re-entry and migrate into the lunar module.
Let me ask you, and everyone listening right now, to think about the terrifying math problem this creates. How do you take a survival kit, mathematically designed to keep 2 people alive for 20 hours, and stretch it to keep 3 grown men alive for 120 hours?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you truly see the terror of their reality. The lunar module was engineered for one very specific short-term task: act as a ferry.
Just down to the moon and back up.
Right. Detach from the main ship, land 2 guys on the lunar surface, and reattach a few hours later. It was entirely inadequate to act as a deep space lifeboat.
The math just doesn't work out.
Its battery systems, water reserves, and environmental scrubbers weren't built for that capacity. And critically, its descent engine was never designed to be fired repeatedly to steer a crippled heavy spacecraft across the solar system.
But they have absolutely no choice. They strapped into the cramped lunar module, and they execute their first critical engine burn. And this maneuver accidentally puts them in the history books for a completely unexpected reason.
Like a distance record.
Yeah. As they swing around the dark side of the moon to catch that gravity assist, they become the furthest human beings have ever traveled from Earth. 400,000 kilometers away. A distance record that still stands to this very day.
But there was zero time to celebrate milestones because the math on the whiteboard back in Houston was still heavily against them. That initial slingshot trajectory would get them home in roughly 153 hours.
And what's the problem with 153 hours?
They categorically did not have 153 hours of water, power, and oxygen. That timeline would leave them with an impossibly tight 1-hour margin of survival.
So the engineers run the numbers again, and they tell the crew they have to fire the lunar module engine a second time to speed up the return. Remember, this is a delicate descent engine, not designed for multiple heavy burns.
But it miraculously works.
It does. They shave the return time down to 143 hours. It bumps their survival margin to 11 hours. But just as they start to breathe a sigh of relief, the literal act of breathing becomes the next legal threat.
Right, the carbon dioxide crisis.
Yeah.
We know that in a sealed environment like a spaceship, the CO2 that astronauts exhale will quickly build up to toxic levels. They were breathing out CO2 much faster than the lunar module's scrubbers could handle.
Because there were 3 of them instead of 2.
Exactly. The spacecraft uses canisters of lithium hydroxide to chemically absorb the carbon dioxide. But the lunar module, designed for a short trip, only had enough of these canisters for 2 people for 2 days.
They were rapidly entering toxic territory. Now, the disabled command module, sitting right next door in the dark, has plenty of extra canisters. Problem solved, right?
You would think so.
Nope. Because they were built by 2 different contractors. The canisters in the command module are square. The receptacle holes in the lunar module's filtration system are round.
It's literally the classic square peg, round hole dilemma.
But the consequence of failing the puzzle is 3 men suffocating in deep space.
This is where we see a masterclass in out-of-the-box engineering under extreme pressure. The experts at Mission Control had roughly 24 hours to invent a solution before the CO2 levels caused irreversible brain damage.
Talk about a ticking clock.
The astronauts read off an inventory of everything they had lying around the cabin: plastic bags, cardboard from flight manuals, spacesuit hoses, and duct tape.
Wait, how do you actually fix an advanced life support system with garbage?
by understanding the physics of a pneumatic seal. Mission Control realizes they don't need the square canister to fit into the round hole. They just need to force the air to flow through the square canister and then route that clean air into the round system.
Oh, that makes sense.
They use the cardboard and plastic bags to create a makeshift funnel around the square canister and heavily wrapped it in duct tape to create an airtight seal. Then they attach the spacesuit hose to the funnel and plug the other end into the round hole of the ship's system.
Commander Lovell later wrote in his book that the resulting contraption wasn't very handsome, but it worked. The fans kicked on, pulled the air through the tape and cardboard, and the toxic CO2 levels finally started to drop.
But solving the air problem didn't solve the water problem.
Right, which brings us to another brutal reality. Imagine trying to survive the most stressful, exhausting week of your life, working around the clock to save your own life, and your daily water intake is restricted to less than a standard child juice box.
Just 200 milliliters a day.
That is barely anything.
And water wasn't just for drinking. It was required to cool the spacecraft's vital electronic systems. But the reason for the severe drinking restriction goes even deeper into the fragile physics of spaceflight.
So what does this all mean? Why restrict the water so brutally? This blew my mind. The source explains that they couldn't afford for the astronauts to urinate too much.
It sounds like a joke, but it's true.
Why? Because venting that liquid urine out into the vacuum of space exerts a physical force. It acts like a tiny, unauthorized thruster.
Exactly.
The mere act of emptying their bladders could literally alter the mathematical trajectory of the spacecraft and push them off their razor-thin survival course. The physical force of urination could ruin a spaceflight. It perfectly illustrates just how unimaginably fragile and mathematically precise space travel actually is.
The physical toll of these restrictions was severe, though. The cabin temperature dropped to near freezing because they had turned off all the heaters to save power. Condensation was dripping off the walls. Between the freezing cold, the immense stress, and the severe dehydration, the three men lost a combined 14 kilograms of body weight. Fred has ended up developing a painful urinary tract infection.
And to make matters worse, despite their best efforts, the spacecraft still started drifting off course.
Right, because of cooling vapor slowly venting from the ship, acting like another tiny, unintended thruster pushing them out of their re-entry corridor.
It's like the universe was just throwing everything at them.
Exactly. If they missed that narrow corridor, they would either burn up in the atmosphere or skip off it entirely and bounce back out into deep space. So Commander Lovell was forced to execute a highly risky third burn of the lunar module engine.
He essentially had to fly the crippled ship manually to correct their path, firing an engine that was only supposed to be used once for a third time.
Thankfully, the hardware held together.
Against every possible odd, the duct tape holds, the engines hold, the mat holds, and they finally approach Earth. But the most dangerous hurdle is still waiting for them re-entry.
The final test.
They have to leave the lunar module, their lifeboat, jettison it into space, and move back into the freezing, powerless command module. Because it is the only piece of the spacecraft equipped with the heat shields necessary to survive hitting the Earth's atmosphere.
As the command module slams into the atmosphere at incredible speeds, the friction creates immense heat, which violently ionizes the surrounding air.
Which causes a massive problem.
Right. This ionization creates a sheath of plasma that completely blocks all radio waves. It causes a total communication blackout between the spacecraft and the ground. This happens on every mission, and it typically lasts for about 2 to 3 minutes.
So the entire world is holding its breath. The exact same TV networks that refused to broadcast the launch because it was boring are now airing this wall-to-wall.
Everyone was watching.
Families, friends, the public, everyone is just staring at a silent radio console. The tension is unbearable. 2 minutes go by, nothing. 3 minutes pass. That is the maximum expected time for the blackout.
And still nothing.
10 more seconds. 30 seconds. A full minute past the deadline. They hit the 4-minute mark of total silence. People in Mission Control are starting to assume the worst, that the heat shield had been secretly cracked by the initial explosion and the craft had burned up.
It was an agonizing, suffocating wait. But finally, at 4 minutes and 27 seconds, a static-filled voice cracks through the radio. Communication is restored.
The collective sigh of relief from the entire planet must have been deafening. The parachutes successfully deploy, and the command module splashes down safely in the Pacific Ocean. All 3 men are alive.
This raises an important question, though. How do we actually define success? Because if you look strictly at the mission parameters, Apollo 13 was a failure.
Right, they didn't land.
It completely failed its primary scientific objective of exploring the Fra Mauro crater. None of the astronauts set foot on the moon. Yet, within the agency and the public consciousness, it is widely considered the space program's most successful hour.
It really was.
It was a masterclass in teamwork, in leadership, and in crisis management.
It fundamentally changed how they operated going forward, too. The investigation into the oxygen tank led to massive new safety measures, redesigning the electrical systems to prevent that exact chain reaction.
Which paved the way for the future.
Exactly. It led to the successful, uninterrupted missions of Apollo 14 through 17, with Apollo 17 in December 1972 being the very last time humans ever traveled to the moon. It's an incredible narrative arc. The public went from being so bored at the launch that they changed the channel to being unified in breathless suspense by the end of the week.
It's a permanent testament to the fact that space travel is never, ever routine. The moment we believe we have conquered an environment as hostile as the vacuum of space, it violently reminds us of how small our margins for error truly are.
Just a tiny mistake.
Yeah, a single drop of a tank years prior, combined with a thermometer dial mechanically incapable of spinning past 30 degrees, almost cost 3 men their lives. And yet, human ingenuity, literally using cardboard and plastic bags to route airflow, was enough to counter that massive technological failure.
It really is the ultimate story of survival and human grit. We've talked about the immense dangers of complacency, the terrifying chain reaction of that 30-degree thermometer cap, and the absolute MacGyver-level brilliance of using duct tape to seal a life support system in deep space.
Incredible stuff.
But as we wrap up this deep dive, there is one final detail from our source material that I want to leave you with. It's that distance record we talked about earlier.
The 400,000 kilometers.
Yes. Apollo 13 still holds the record for the furthest distance humans have ever traveled away from Earth. As you go about the rest of your day, I want you to ponder the deep, beautiful irony of that fact. Think about it. Our species' absolute furthest physical reach into the cosmos wasn't some grand, meticulously calculated triumph of scientific exploration.
It was a complete accident.
It was a sheer accident. Our deepest footprint in the universe was driven entirely by the desperate, raw human instinct to simply find a way back home.